We've been throwing a lot of ideas at you this morning. I want you to be working on your questions. So I'm just going to throw out a couple fire starters. I want you to imagine that we're at a dinner party at my house. We've just had a glass of wine or two. We're very relaxed, and the subject of the future of work comes up, and it just so happens that my guests are deeply knowledgeable on different aspects of the topic. So I want to start off with Mia Birdsong, who is just an iconic activist and representative of thinking and activities for communities. And so I'd love it if you just tell people a little bit about your work,
Sure.
And then help people to understand a little bit what sort of one fire starter idea for you. How do you think communities can be that sort of ecosystem that I was talking about, where everybody can thrive around the future of work?
Totally. Hi.
Go for it.
Good morning. It's still morning, yes? All right. So the work that I do is really about the social contract. And I think about that in two ways. One is what institutions and organizations provide for us, and one is what we provide for each other. And I'm going to focus on the former. So I think about, what cities or municipalities should provide for their residents, what workplaces should provide for their workers. And when I think about those two things, I use the word residents and workers very specifically. If we talk about citizens, we begin to create two classes of people, one that our municipalities and cities serve and one that it doesn't. When we talk about organizations and workplaces, if we talk about employees, then we also are leaving out a huge part of the workforce, right? So I think about workers. And I use that language because the work that I do really focuses on listening to, centering, lifting up the voices, expertise, wisdom, knowledge, and creativity of people who have the least power in our systems. So I'm talking about people of color, I'm talking about black folks, I'm talking about unhoused people, poor people, women in many cases, queer folks, sex workers, the people who do not run our institutions, do not run our cities, despite 30 years of data and research that tells us that organizations do better with a diversity of people running them. Stuff is still largely run by white men. When I'm looking at this room, I'm clear that that's kind of who we have in this room, right? So in that work, centering kind of the most marginalized people, the people who hold the least power in institutions, part of what I think about is what does it look like to follow folks' leadership? So it's not just about, surveying people and then kind of deciding for yourselves what it is you're learning from that research. It really is about how do you create pipelines of leadership so that you have people who are most experiencing some of the problems we want to solve, right? Actually running things.
Right, right. So obviously we failed miserably on this panel with 4 out of 5 of us. Because
I'm
the profile you're talking about. So I'm just going to call out the elephant on the dais. But hopefully what we've got is diversity of thought.
I'm happy to be your token black person.
I don't want you to have the weight of every community on your shoulders, but at least it's a good start. So Jason, I'm not going to put the weight of every organization on your shoulders. And actually I want to thank Steve Hatfield for allowing us to switch chairs at the dinner party and allow you to join us. So you've been in the HR arena for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about your work at Cisco, and then give us another sort of fire starter idea around what organizations can do differently.
Sure, happy to be the proxy representative for every corporate in every organization that's here today.
And big business and small, so let's make sure we're sort of spanning the universe.
Exactly. So myself, I like to say I have 4 kind of main jobs at Cisco. The one that's most prevalent or important for this panel is the digitization. I'm on point to kind of think about how we digitize the employee experience at Cisco globally. Some of the other roles I have, I'm accountable for global talent acquisition, so clearly there's a connection there, back end of HR, and if that's not enough, I'm also our global chief of staff as well. But when you think about fire starter issues for us, it's interesting, there's not a single one. I'm going to quickly weave a couple thoughts together. Anytime you think about the future of work, at least from our perspective, and when you think about what's been discussed, especially this morning, because I saw every presentation, there's cultural implications to being able to actually move the needle on this. And for us at Cisco and for where I sit, the cultural transformation that is on the front of it is probably the most important thing that we're doing. So we've moved forward with this concept called the people deal, which has kind of set the stage culturally. Our CEO, our leadership, our entire company's bought off on it. That set the stage for us to be able to move the needle on this journey. And then probably the secondary, most important issue is being able to start thinking about how you can move away from traditional hierarchies. And it's tough when you think about kind of corporations or small, medium to large size businesses, because your traditional hierarchy is how everything kind of gets done. But how do you tap into the network? How do you get very clear on what that ecosystem looks like? And for us at Cisco, it's really starting to think more horizontally and mining the insights and the power of those networks and moving away from traditional hierarchies.
Yeah, if you think about it, hierarchies really were, I mean, we actually have inherited the way we think about hierarchies going all the way back to Alexander the Great and armies, and the idea that you had to give an order that was passed down through a pyramid, right? And that's for a world that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we have instantaneous communication. So the very nature of the organization is we think about flattening hierarchies, but that's still a hierarchy. It's much more of a networked kind of mentality, right? Yeah, correct. Absolutely. So Marco, you have a series of articles that you've posted recently where you talk about a hitchhiker's guide to the economy, where you're trying to help people sort of work through a range of different perspectives about some of the macro issues related to economies. Can you talk a little bit about, you've got a couple of sort of key points, I think, that from your perspective about what is it that those decision makers need to be tracking on, or what are the ways they can think differently about the future of work?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And I tend to look at it from two different perspectives. One is the perspective of the economist, my sad and dismal background, and part of it is the experience of having worked on business innovation and strategy in a large company as GE, and being very much in touch with the innovation that is happening in Silicon Valley and figuring out how is it impacting industries and the workplace. And when I put it in the context of the challenges for countries, I think there are really three issues that governments around the world need to look at more closely. The first one is to go back to the basics and realize that in a world where innovation moves faster and is disrupting industries and economies and labor markets at a faster pace, we need more flexibility. And unfortunately, what you see in a number of countries is instead an effort to try to create more rigidity, more constraints, or to go back to the old ways. Now, this is especially true in places like Europe, but increasingly, even in the US, you see a desire to go back to the old jobs, to the old ways. Now, one of my favorite examples on this is there's a concern of technology displacing jobs. The concern is very acute here in the US. It's very strongly felt in Europe as well. If you look at the European countries where unemployment is high, around 10%, and youth unemployment around 30% for the last 30 years, they are the countries which are most backwards in terms of technology. So if we don't fix that flexibility, we can't help with the technology. The second issue is education. You mentioned it at the beginning, Gary. This is your backyard. You know a lot about it. But I think restructuring the education system, introducing better forms of credentialing, so having a system that is more flexible and more tied to the skills we need today is fundamental. And the third issue is a revised social safety net, because in a world of greater churn in the labor market, we will need to rethink the social safety net, healthcare benefits, pension benefits, unemployment benefits, and also new ways of supporting people as they go through lifelong learning.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. So, and I think I would be surprised if we didn't get some questions about universal basic income and some of the ways that Silicon Valley thinks about trying to mechanistically solve some of these problems, which should make for a healthy debate. So, John, Marco was talking about different countries. You lecture all around the world. What are some of the issues that you track on or that you think jump up as concerns when you talk to people in different countries? Do you see some of these same patterns that Marco is talking about?
Yeah, I'd say that it's actually the focus. I'm finishing a new book, and one of the things that I see, and it ties back to this theme of fear, growing fear about loss of jobs, loss of work, do I have a future, is that I think increasingly around the world we're falling prey to what I would describe as threat-based narratives. And it's not just one side or the others. I'll talk about the US because that's the one I know best, but I think it's true around the world. The way we're responding to fear on both sides of the aisle is a threat-based narrative. It's a call to action that says the enemy is coming to kill us. If we don't mobilize now and resist, we're all going to die. And in a world of fear, that plays quite well.
Right.
But I would say also that as human beings, I believe we all have a hunger for hope. We want to believe there's something worth living for. And no one, in my view, is effectively targeting that narrative of opportunity.
Right.
What is the call to action that says, if we came together, what could we accomplish together? What amazing things could we accomplish together?
So I think we're starting that right here. So questions from the audience? Do we have any mic runners out there? What are some of the burning questions that you folks have? Oh, suddenly there's an audience. Amazing. You are here. Any burning questions? Raise your hand. One over here. And while you're doing that, let me ask one more question. So talking about some of that positive narrative. So at the community level, do you feel, I mean, we tend to think of so much of this era as being this sort of polarizing sort of environment. And I don't even use phrases like red state, blue state, or any of those sorts of things, because I think that actually leads to this polarizing sort of framing of things. Some of the communities that where I'd lecture and talk to a lot of community leaders, a lot of those issues don't come up. There's much more a focus of trying to help the community actually to be able to knit together. Do you see that same sort of thing?
I think that in places where people have continually not been served by systems and institutions that serve us, folks figure it out. What they're focused on is how do we make sure that all of us survive? And there is a beautiful kind of inspiration for the rest of us that I think points to your point about hope, John, in that, like, you know, in places where people don't have enough money or whatever kinds of resources we actually need to survive, what folks do is they work together. Like, that's how people survive, is that they're relying on each other in order to make it. And I think that what we miss in our cities and municipalities is the idea that, like, we actually don't need to come in and solve people's problems as much as we need to actually leverage what they're already doing.
Right, absolutely. Mayors ask me all the time, where do I start? And I always tell them, you have started.
People are doing it already.
There are businesses, people are working. What you've got is an ecosystem that's not actually optimized.
When I think about what you were talking about in terms of hierarchical like structures and the effort to, like, change culture. And when you have, I mean, I think about the spaces that I'm in with primarily Black women, right? Black women's culture of leadership is non-hierarchical. It is deeply collaborative. It is, it's not about winners and losers. It's not about somebody holding power and kind of dictating to everybody else what to do. And I think about what organizations are losing by not actually inviting that culture of leadership into them. Absolutely. Like, those solutions exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you want to respond to that, or?
No, I totally agree. And just using us as a case study at Cisco, we've trained almost 8 million people globally around the world on the digital skills of the future. It's through our Net Academy, whether we're in Germany helping to retrain, reskill, whatever phrase you want to use, get them certified, whether they're Syrian refugees sitting in Germany, copy and paste that across the globe. Totally agree. There's so many organizations doing so many things, and I think everybody sits back and assumes that nothing is going on, some big crescendo moment has to happen, and that's not the reality. It's already occurring. It's just how you tap into it and leverage it.
Right. Yeah, it's happening much more at the grassroots level. So I've been monopolizing them. Please tell us who you are and your question.
Hi. Good morning. I'm Margarita Fontana. I'm very curious about knowing your thoughts on the school of the future. I think John mentioned that there are great capabilities around when you look at kids and what they do and the way they interact. So how would you, if you had the chance to shape the education system in your country or wherever, which discipline will you focus? How would you shape it in order to create the exponential changing leaders of the future?
So I have my own answer to that, but I'd love it if any of your thoughts first.
I'll bring up one point which, in response to this, which also connects to the issue of the narrative of threat. And my point is the following. Reshaping the education system should, one, give the education system more flexibility, so insist that people can learn in a more creative way and jumping in and out of different fields. Giving attention both to what we call here liberal arts education, but also giving a lot more emphasis to STEM, so science and engineering. The second thing the system should do is also make people more interested in the kind of jobs that are available today. Something that worries me when we have discussions on the education system is we tend to say the education system should either prepare everybody for very high-tech jobs or just prepare everybody to be a very creative philosopher and artist, because that's all that is going to be left after the robots take all the job. And by doing this with this narrative of fear, we are discouraging people from getting interested in jobs in manufacturing, in construction, in various industries around the world, where paradoxically in the US, for example, today, we have shortages of skills in the very sectors where we are being told that there will be massive disruption, massive automation in the future. And I think this is important because for young kids, learning the work skills of today creates the basis for them upgrading and following up and becoming conversant with the newer technologies as the technologies improve. And this is something you see around the world. With GE, for example, we had done experiments with maker labs, bringing machines, 3D printers, around the world, including in Africa, to get young kids to play with them and to learn and to demystify these new technologies. So I think, in a nutshell, this mixture of having a more flexible education system, but also an education system that brings the kids closer to the world of work sooner, for me, will be the most important step.
I'll add to that, too. I completely agree 100% with what he said. And then, this is just a personal thought for me. And I say this because I've got a 19-year-old that's in college. Somehow, when you step back and you look at the last 15 to 20 years, it's like this subculture that says you ultimately will be far more successful if you go to college than if you didn't. It's like permeated the DNA. And I remember sitting back going, why do we assume that that's the philosophy that has to take root, that says if you don't go to a four-year academic institution, you're not going to be successful? So it's interesting. And even in Cisco, I mean, every company is facing the same, tech shortage, gap of skills, supply and demand, pipeline challenges. They're out there for everybody. And when you spend time in Europe, when you spend time in other countries, you start to realize there's a lot of areas that they do it a whole lot better than us in the United States. Let's just start with the apprenticeship model, where you take really good, high talented kids out of high school, and then you put them in an apprenticeship track. We don't have to wait for 4 years of college or a graduate degree or a doctorate degree or a postdoctorate degree for a lot of the jobs that we have out there. So we're facing that dilemma right now and thinking differently. And when I see what goes on in the UK with apprenticeship programs and other areas across Europe, it really, to me, challenges at least my organization that I'm in, but also others as well, to really start to think outside the box. Because if we assume that the current path that we have is going to be the current path in the future, that gap's going to get broader and broader.
So can I just say,
Please.
I mean, I'm thinking about what John said earlier about how people go to school and that's where we lose our creativity, right? And there is in the US we have a deeply class-based education system, largely because our funding structures are based on property taxes, which to me seems unconstitutional. The idea that wealthy neighborhoods, actually those schools in wealthy neighborhoods get more money than schools in poor neighborhoods. So I think about that piece and what we need to do about that to make things more equitable. And I think about the teaching profession itself and how expensive it is to become a teacher, and how many teachers we lose once people start to want to actually raise families. And that when teachers in the US are primarily white women. So we also need to be thinking about how do we get men in classrooms and how do we get people of color in classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to step out of the moderator's role and offer an opinion too about the education. So it's ironic because I don't have enough college to stuff into a thimble, and here I am talking about reshaping education. But having Heidi and my 22-year-old son Christian is actually here. He just graduated from college, so they do come out the other end. I just wanted to let you know that does happen. And what I'm going to talk about also in the education and the learning block is I believe there's actually 4 things that schools need to teach, and it's focused on transferable skills. Problem solvers who are adaptive, creative, and entrepreneurial. So what do I mean by that? And I posted a piece on LinkedIn. You can see where I wrote this up. Problem solvers, because that's why people pay us. That's why we are paid to do work, is to solve problems. Some people say there's some kinds of government work where we actually create problems, but I don't use that kind of joke. I think that's wrong. So problem solvers who are adaptive, that is, where the pace of change is only going to continue. creative, because that's what keeps us ahead of robots and software, and entrepreneurial in our thinking, that is continually floating and wanting to solve the next problems. And that's, when I think about reshaping education, if we can help kids to learn those much more adaptive skills, that's actually what's going to help them to be much more prepared for the world of tomorrow. John, do you have any thoughts on this, or going to move on?
Just a few. I mean, I'll restrain. I think that one of the key things in terms of rethinking education is reorganizing education around the student rather than the curriculum. It's all about the student, cultivating that curiosity, giving them environments where they can pursue that curiosity, and ultimately my belief is the key to success is finding a passion. And the whole goal of a school should be to help everyone find a passion and then pursue it.
Right, absolutely. Other questions from the audience? Raise your hand, please. You've got a couple over here. Do we have, no, sorry, in back, yeah.
Hi, Lynn Wells. The question here is a public policy question. In the concept of fear and everything we've got here in the US, Europe, is the best way to start at the national level to try to address the public policy, or start at the community level and try to work up where you have a better sense of community and better sense of working together?
You just answered your own question. I mean, I think that, yeah, I think partly because I think, you know, the United States is a really big country that when we create things at the federal level, if we start there, we also end up with like things that don't make anybody happy. Whereas if we can start in communities and actually work with people we have connection with and relationship to and have to live with, right? Like I don't have to live with somebody in Iowa, but I have to live with, I live in Oakland, I have to live with people in the Bay. So being able to build connection in those ways and build community and make us feel less of that stratification that exists right now, and coming up with solutions that work for everyone, and I think, again, center the people who have the least power right now, I think is way more effective than trying to create things like that nationally.
I think there is another reason, which is it allows you to experiment, because right now there is so much uncertainty, and the uncertainty will continue going forward. We do not have the definitive answers that we can impose confidently at the national level, so doing it at the community level allows you to experiment and find out what works.
Yeah. So I would say it actually has to be both and. It can't just be at the local level. Before I was in high tech, I spent a decade in healthcare, and nothing was more frustrating for me knowing that I couldn't just create portability when you think about digitization and the virtualization of the delivery of care from state to state to state to state to state. So that's federal laws, federal licensing, credentialing requirements make it very difficult to deliver the next generation of healthcare and healthcare delivery. So I agree it's got to be bottoms up, but it also has to be top down simultaneously if we're truly going to move the needle.
So let me give you one example where we actually feel it can be done top down. Is my group back in 2007, we co-founded something called the National Broadband Coalition in the US. And our whole goal was to bring together 137 organizations to develop a broadband strategy for the United States, because the United States didn't have one. And so we just built one. And then the FCC, when Obama came into power, he called for the FCC to have a national broadband strategy. They took a lot of our work, and it unleashed hundreds of millions of dollars for local broadband deployments. And that's one of those rare cases where we were able to build the kind of consensus to do something the government hadn't done, and the government looked over and said, okay, yeah, we definitely need that. We don't have a national work strategy. We don't have anything where we agree on those points that I was making earlier. We don't agree on what that benevolent future looks like for everybody, or where everybody can thrive. And that's one of the places, I think, where we can actually help to move the needle, if we can build that kind of consensus. So wherever we've got a microphone, raise your hand. Sorry, back here. Introduce yourself, please.
E. Hello?
Yeah.
E from Los Angeles. I was going to ask, in regards to if the statistics are pointing to increased diversity being better, from a macro sense, is it more a lack of proportional diversity, or more of an issue of proportional ambition levels? And the fact that, basically how Mr. Hagel had spoke about the women panel was amazing the other day. And I was thinking, is it more and more something where people don't feel comfortable being in that environment where they would even be judged? So why would I even want to try to do that?
Okay.
And then going forward, second question, in SU language, in an exponential sense, where is the requirements, or do you think there will be requirements for the empathetic training through VR and things of that nature?
Okay. So, John, do you want to take that first since he's...
Sure. I think that there's certainly more and more evidence that diversity produces more creative outcomes and higher impact outcomes. I do think that one of my biggest frustrations is in organizations that have embraced diversity. And they bring in a very diverse group around the table, and the first message to everyone around the table is watch the leader, that older white guy, and become as much like him as you possibly can, because that's the way to succeed here. And don't challenge, because friction is bad in scalable efficiency environments. And so that's missing the whole opportunity. I mean, again, don't get me started, but one of my biggest things is watching women becoming more and more like men in these institutions, because that's what they've been told is the key to success. Right. And the whole key to success for the institution and for the individual is embracing that, what we call productive friction, that it's the willingness to challenge each other with respect, based on diverse perspectives, diverse experience, backgrounds. That's going to be the key to driving higher impact.
That's great.
From a large corporation kind of perspective, it's interesting because there's so many levers that need to be pulled on this. 100% agree with that. Second, I think a lot of organizations just don't know where to start, believe it or not, because they don't have the data that they can align to actually create an action plan against. And so when I say data, it's twofold. It's what's the market availability by gender, by ethnicity. And when you think globally, that gets hard to identify and pull first. Secondly, it's when you think about developing the action plan on it, again, for global organizations, there's so many unconscious biases that are just riddled into it. So for us, we're actually going down the road of trying to do as much blind interviewing as possible. So you take the names, you take the addresses off the resume. When the manager or the panel goes through, how do you ensure and mandate that you have, one, a diverse representative panel, but two, you're making it as blind as possible. So at the time when it comes to, I want that person to come in regardless of the level in the organization, that's probably your first introduction to gender or race. So there's a lot of pilots and a lot of kind of sample activities going on, but it really goes down to the root of the unconscious bias element of it.
And I think that, getting people in the door is one piece, but those unconscious biases remain in the organization among all of the people in it. So once that person comes in, and this is what you're talking about, like, do you even want to go into a workplace where you don't see yourself and the culture of the organization actually isn't embracing diversity other than having body, numbers, right? So I think that there is, the space of diversity and inclusion has done a good job on focusing on like the optics of things, but we haven't really begun to have the conversation we need to have about power and what it means for the people who are holding power to let go of some of that power. And that's partly because we have scarcity mentalities about what power is like. So when I think about the language, and I don't know anything about singularity or AI, but when I think about the language of abundance and kind of how the way that I understand it, it really is about us being able to say what, there's enough for all of us, right. Whether it's money or food or housing or power, there actually is enough for all of us. And when those of us who hold power let go of some of it so that people who have been historically disenfranchised and don't have that power and they get to have some, we don't become less powerful, we become less burdened. And ultimately, we all do better when we all do better. And I think that this conversation about, and folks who hold power dealing with some of the deeply personal fear, right, that we have about somebody taking what we own, right? Somebody taking what we've got. Until we're ready to have that conversation, we're still going to be in this place where diversity is about optics, and it's not actually about shifting the culture of organizations or shifting who is running things.
Okay, so just because we're running out of time now, folks, I'm going to ask for a lightning round here. I'm going to ask each of you to answer two questions very quickly. Because I do this when we help people to think about major systemic change. In 10 years, what's the one thing you wish we will have done today? I give you a magic wand. You can actually move the needle as it relates to the future of work. In 10 years, what's the one thing that you wish we'll have done today? And how would we know? If that actually happened, how would we know? Anybody want to jump in first? Mark, I can tell you're thinking. So you've got a magic wand, 10 years. What's the one thing you think would move the needle the most?
For me, it really goes back to the issue of turning the education system upside down and getting it closer to the world of work today, so that we can get kids to start learning skills, practical skills and flexible skills today. For me, that is the key. And
how would we know if we were successful? Like, would we just see the numbers of people going into different industries, or how would we know?
We will have a larger distribution of people working in different industries with better jobs thanks to the technology.
Yeah.
If we fail, we will know very clearly if we fail, because as an economist, I firmly believe that there will be abundance and that 20 years from now we'll have more jobs, but in 10 years, if we get this wrong, we'll have unemployment at 20%.
Right, because it will be asymmetrical. John, do you have thoughts on this? Magic wand.
10 years from now, I think to me, again, I talked about it, but that we're all coming together around an opportunity-based narrative, that there's something that is bringing us together to accomplish something that none of us could accomplish on our own. And I think looking at today, I mean, to me, one of the key things I look for is how many people have real passion about what they're doing. Our best estimate, we did a survey of the U.S. workforce. In the U.S. workforce, at best, 12% of U.S. workers have any passion about the work they're doing.
I'll add to that. I'm just going to play off both of theirs. It's interesting when you get into these settings, but because it's so easy to funnel down towards the concepts of skills and experiences. But where my head is, I am equally as passionate about the strengths-based equation on this. So to both your points, when you think globally and you think about what everybody is saying on the fear side and the gaps and unemployment and all that, I would love to get to a point where the opportunity is so robust and so bright that every single individual has the opportunity to use their strengths and is rewarded based off their strengths and what they bring, even more so than the skills and the experiences.
Mia, take us home.
I would like us to have a safety net that is not paternalistic, that's based on generosity, that provides people with a tremendous amount of agency and flexibility. It is one of the things, I've been having conversations with poor people around the country about guaranteed income, and that conversation is really about the social contract, right? It is about what we owe each other, what government owes us, and deservedness, what work means for people. And one of the things that people really are drawn to when it comes to the conversation about guaranteed income is that it is something that provides them with agency and flexibility. And I don't oppose guaranteed income, but I feel like it's something that points to an ideology that I think we should apply more broadly to our safety net system.
Yeah, when I've written about this, I said the issue is not, well, robots and software take all jobs, so we need a basic income. It's, should any human being go to bed at night without food on the table or a roof over their head? Exactly. That's really what we need to solve for. So, and with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. Please thank my guests. We've had a wonderful dinner party. Glad you could observe.